Have you wondered how it is possible that a driver like Lewis Hamilton, with a clear podium pace, ends up losing positions without being able to defend himself, even going flat out on each straight? Because what happened in Japan was not a simple drop in performance, it was something much more serious. Ferrari engineers have uncovered some data that not only explains the lack of power during a race, but also reveals a hidden problem at the heart of the car that could completely change the course of its season. And the worst thing is not what has already happened, but what could happen again if they don't understand it in time. What happened to Lewis Hamilton in the Japanese Grand Prix cannot be understood if we only look at the final result, because finishing sixth does not reflect at all what was really happening inside the car. During the first laps, everything seemed to be under control. The pace was there, the track position was solid, and the initial sensations pointed to a completely different race, one of those where Ferrari could definitively establish itself as a real contender. But little by little something strange began to appear, something that did not fit either with the weekend's performance or with the expected behavior of the car, and Hamilton began to lose ground in a totally unnatural way, especially on the straights, where he simply could not compete. The most striking thing is that it was not a question of tire degradation or a bad strategy, because the loss was constant, progressive, and above all, repetitive at the same points on the circuit. Every time I exited a corner and faced an acceleration zone, the car did not respond as it should, as if it lacked that extra push that makes the difference in modern Formula One. And this is where the situation starts to get really worrying, because Hamilton wasn't making mistakes, he wasn't managing poorly, he wasn't out of position, he was running the race correctly, but the car just wasn't giving him what he needed. After the race, the driver's feelings confirmed what was already sensed from the outside, and that is that there was something deeply wrong with the power delivery. Hamilton made it clear that he was following all the team's instructions regarding energy management, that he was applying the throttle when he should, and that he still couldn't keep up with the others. This completely changes the narrative, because when a driver of his level expresses this type of technical frustration, it means that the problem is not with the driving, but with a structural failure of the system. And this is where the data comes in, because when engineers started analyzing the telemetry, what they found not only explained the loss of performance, but opened up a much bigger concern. The problem was not simply a lack of raw power, but an inconsistent, irregular, and out-of-sync delivery, something that in today's Formula One, where energy management is everything, can completely destroy your race without there being an immediate solution on the track. The most serious thing is that this behavior continued for practically the entire race, which indicates that it was not a one-time failure, but rather a persistent problem that Ferrari could not correct in real time. This leads us to a disturbing conclusion. Hamilton did not lose positions because others were faster, but because his car was not performing correctly in one of the most critical aspects of performance. And when that happens in such a tight championship, the problem stops being an anecdote and becomes a direct threat to the entire sporting project. When Ferrari engineers began to delve into the data after the race, what they found not only confirmed Lewis Hamilton's feelings, but also set off all the alarms within the team, because the problem was not in an isolated component, but in the core of the car's performance, the energy management of the hybrid system. This is where everything changes, because in current Formula One, especially with the 2026 regulations, power no longer depends solely on the thermal engine, but on how the electrical energy is managed in each phase of a lap, and that balance was exactly what failed. The telemetry data revealed a clear desynchronization between energy recovery and its subsequent deployment, meaning that the car was not properly using the stored electricity. In simple but devastating terms, Hamilton was coming out of corners without the energy needed to accelerate to maximum speed on the straights, leaving him completely exposed to his rivals. It wasn't that it had less total power available, it was that it didn't have it at the right time, and in Formula One that's practically the same as not having it at all. This type of failure is especially critical because it is not perceived as an obvious problem from the outside. There's no smoke, there are no brakes, there are no dramatic messages on the radio, but the lap time begins to drop, defenses become impossible, and overtaking against the other becomes inevitable. It is a silent but lethal failure. And the most worrying thing is that the data showed clear differences even within the team itself, which points directly to a specific problem in the configuration or software of Hamilton's car, rather than a general limitation of the Ferrari. This is where the situation becomes even more delicate, because a software failure in hybrid management is not something that can be solved simply by changing a part. It requires understanding exactly at what point in the energy cycle the error is occurring, how it affects braking recovery, and why the deployment does not match the needs of the pilot on the track. It is a problem of synchronization, of internal logic of a system, and that implies time, simulations, validations, something that you cannot always solve from one race to the next. Furthermore, the fact that this problem had already shown signs since qualifying adds an extra layer of concern, because it means that Ferrari was already living with this anomaly without having fully diagnosed it. They came to the race with a system that did not work 100%, and that in such a competitive championship is practically condemning you to losing performance without the possibility of reacting. All of this brings us to a key point within the narrative. We are no longer talking about a bad race, but rather a structural failure that calls into question Ferrari's complete understanding of its own car. And when a team doesn't fully master its hybrid system in this new era, the problem isn't just losing a podium, it's losing the ability to compete at the highest level on a consistent basis. And this is where everything becomes much more serious than it seems, because what the engineers have discovered not only explains what happened in Japan, but also leaves an open threat for the rest of Lewis Hamilton's season. Because if this problem of desynchronization in energy management is not fully understood, is not a failure that will disappear on its own, is a pattern that can be repeated in any circuit where hybrid efficiency makes a difference, Ferrari now faces an extremely delicate situation because it is no longer enough to find a quick solution. They need to understand the exact origin of the problem. And that means reviewing absolutely everything, from the energy deployment maps through braking recovery to the behavior of the software that decides when and how that electrical power is released. Because the real danger here is that the car on the surface works, but in reality it is losing performance at the most critical moments of each lap. This completely changes the team's focus, because they are no longer just chasing performance improvements, but rather trying to correct an internal weakness that may be limiting the full potential of the car. And in a championship where every tenth counts, where the differences are minimal, and where rivals are unforgiving, having a hybrid system that does not respond precisely is practically a competitive sentence. In addition, there is a factor that aggravates the scenario even more, and that is time. Formula One does not stop, the races continue to advance, and Ferrari has no room to experiment for several weekends. They need immediate answers, but this type of problem does not always offer them. And that puts Hamilton in a very complicated position, because he can be driving at the limit, executing each phase of a race perfectly, and still continue to lose positions due to something that is completely out of his control. The big question that remains in the air is disturbing. If Ferrari fails to correct this flaw at its roots, how many more opportunities will they lose without even fully understanding why? Because what happened in Japan was no exception. It could be the first real warning of a much bigger problem. The conclusion of all this analysis is as clear as it is disturbing. What happened to Lewis Hamilton in Japan was not an isolated incident nor a simple circumstantial loss of performance, but evidence of a deep technical problem that Ferrari still does not have completely under control. And in a Formula One where the difference between winning and losing is measured in millimeter details, failing precisely in energy management at the heart of current performance is something that can compromise much more than a single race. Because the truly worrying thing is not that Hamilton didn't have power, it's that the car didn't know when to give it to him. That desynchronization, that invisible mismatch between what the driver asks and what the car responds, is the type of problem that not only makes you lose positions, but completely breaks your ability to compete consistently. And when that happens, it doesn't matter the talent of the driver, the strategy, or the base pace, you are simply at a disadvantage. Ferrari is now at a critical point in the season, where it needs to show that it understands its own car at the highest level. Because if they fail to correct this root failure, we are not talking about a specific error, but rather a structural weakness that can appear at any time, in any circuit, and in the worst possible circumstances. And this is where it comes full circle. Japan was not the problem, it was the warning. Now the real question is whether Ferrari will be able to react in time, or if this failure will mark the beginning of a crisis much bigger than they imagine. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.